I'm sure you followed up the story on Russia bounties, giving bounties to Taliban. House Committee on Foreign Relations is having a hearing on Thursday, and they also invited Mike Pompeo to discuss the topic. What is your thoughts about it, and do you think it's going to change or impact the U.S. policy for Afghanistan?
Ultimately, I'm not sure whether it's going to change the U.S. policy towards Afghanistan. The U.S. policy towards Afghanistan involves a deal with the Taliban for withdrawal. If anything, it will change, and I think the focus of Congress is on U.S. attitudes towards Russia. It seems that Donald Trump has made a decision that he wants to withdraw, and the United States is going to continue with that, regardless of what the evidence appears at this moment in time.
So do you think with this thing, like Kremlin has changed the view of U.S. war in Afghanistan?
It's changed the view of the U.S. war in Afghanistan a little bit, but only to give the United States an excuse on why it suffered so much. It doesn't seem that there's an appetite among either the Democrats or the Republicans to stay in Afghanistan in order to defeat the Taliban. It seems that the United States and Republicans are intent on ending what once was described as the good war, but now is talked about just America's longest war or its endless war.
So what's your thoughts of Taliban relation with Russia? What is it Russia wants there?
Well, you know, of course the Russians have no love for the Taliban and vice versa. They were united only in a temporary alliance that was formed on the basis of hatred towards the United States. The Taliban wanted to defeat the United States, and that ultimately bolsters the narrative of Islamists that they had defeated two superpowers. The Taliban were 4 years old at the time that the Soviet Union left, so the Taliban shouldn't claim credit for that, the Northern Alliance should. But the Russians simply wanted to ensure that the United States didn't become entrenched. Russia is much more intent on breaking down any U.S. efforts to bring stability to Afghanistan or other region of the world, rather than imposing their own sort of stability. Vladimir Putin wants to restore the prestige that Russia had during the days of the Soviet Union, and he blames the United States for having hastened the downfall of the Soviet Union, for having victimized Russia. And so his alliance with the Taliban, he sees as revenge.
Pakistan and China, they had a trilateral video conference with Afghan government, and they were discussing peace process. And both China and Pakistan welcomed the process of prisoners' release. And they also urged Taliban for reduction in violence and preparing for inter-Afghan talks. What's your thoughts of these neighboring countries to make this talk between US and Taliban a success for Afghanistan?
Well, you know, there's a history here that when Pakistani officials have gone to Kabul or have talked in other ways with the Afghan government, they always say the right things. They say they want stable relations, they want good neighbor relations, they want peace. But 80% of the precursor chemicals for the improvised explosive devices that are used by the Taliban in Afghanistan still come from Pakistan. There were hearings about this in the US Congress going back to the year 2010, 2012, and so forth. But with the drawdown of US forces, the US isn't monitoring this as much. And the Afghans say that this continues, so the Pakistani government needs to decide whether they're going to actually put any action behind their rhetoric, or take the Quetta Shura, or the Miran Shah Shura, or look at the Haqqani network in Peshawar. These Taliban leaders have spent their whole lives in Pakistan. Pakistan can't say they want good neighborly relations with Afghanistan if they continue to shelter and assist Taliban leaders who are planning terrorism and attacks inside Afghanistan. So really the ball is in Pakistan's court right now, whether they're going to put any action behind their rhetoric, whether the words of the Pakistani diplomats, the president, the prime minister, the military mean anything, or whether it's just the ISI commanders which are calling the shots. Ultimately, however, number one, the biggest problem with the American peace deal with the Taliban is it doesn't include Pakistan. Dealing with the Taliban without including Pakistan is like Hezbollah without including Iran. I mean,
yeah, Afghan government on Monday, hold a meeting with representatives from 18 countries, including UN, US, and OIC, on peace process and talks and economic and everything. Do you think this is a way that it is paving the path for launching or starting the inter-Afghan talks with Taliban?
well, the problem is I don't think the Taliban really want inter-Afghan talks. These talks were, of course, supposed to start by a strict timeline after the signing of the February 29th peace accord, but it hasn't. There's still disputes over the prisoner releases. And on top of which, the Taliban haven't shown any indication to want to reduce violence inside Afghanistan directed towards Afghan forces, and that is undercutting any notion of the Afghan dialogue. And while it's not talked about in the United States, all Afghans remember that when the Taliban invaded Kabul in 1996, it was against the backdrop of intra-Afghan talks. And so there's a great deal of suspicion which needs to be addressed. This is why I don't think there's going to be progress until the Taliban actually show that they can reduce violence or have any desire to.
Yeah, and the last question, Afghanistan refused to release 600 out of 5,000 Taliban prisoners, according to, as requested by Taliban, and claiming that they have a criminal background. Do you think it will impact also at the start of the talks with the Taliban?
Well, the Taliban are looking for any excuse to avoid actually having to move forward with the talks. At the same time, the Afghan government could look at the prisoners the Taliban were supposed to release and note that instead of releasing Afghan military prisoners and so forth, they had taken a lot of civilians hostage just for the purpose of then turning around and releasing them. And so I think there's a lot of bad faith, but if we had to look at where the bad faith lies, it's almost exclusively on the part of the Taliban.
There was also, just a last question, I remember, National Defense Authorization Act. It was discussed recently in the Congress, it's passed. And it's also part of it, kind of like blocking the timeline or withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. What's your thoughts of these timelines and approach of defense strategy that they're trying to take the troops out of Afghanistan according to the agreement, peace agreement in February with the Taliban?
Well, I think there are a growing group of bipartisan analysts who believe that any withdrawal needs to be based on the situation on the ground rather than some artificial political timeline that was concocted in Doha and Qatar. The problem is that there doesn't seem to be a will on the part of either the Trump administration or on the part of Democratic candidate Joe Biden to want to double down and do what's needed to either defeat the Taliban or put the economic and diplomatic pressure on Pakistan to cut off the support. Frankly, there is never going to be peace in Afghanistan until Pakistan is forced to stop doing what it has been doing for the last 20 years.
Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. I think we covered everything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.